Torvan's shuttle docked at the Coalition Command Center on Aethys Prime, just under 4 hours after he left Earth's orbital station. His legs were unsteady as he walked down the ramp. His mind was still turning over every word Admiral Hobbs had said, trying to find the sense in it. Aethys Prime was a station world, a vast artificial structure built in open space, designed to serve as a neutral meeting ground for the 7 Coalition species. It hung in the dark like a small moon made of metal and glass. Inside it was crowded with diplomats, officers, refugees, and soldiers from every member species. The mood was grim. After the disaster at Selhari Rift, the entire alliance felt like it was standing on the edge of a cliff. Torvan made his way to the central war chamber, a wide circular room with tiered seating and a massive holographic display in the center, showing the current map of the conflict. Every surviving admiral and general of the coalition was present. The room smelled of tension and exhaustion. He delivered the message exactly as Hobbs had given it. The reaction was immediate and loud. Admiral Rathan of the Turani, a tall being with smooth blue skin and wide silver eyes, leaned forward in his seat. "They want us to retreat further? We have already lost half our territory. If we pull back behind the Mirren line, we abandon 12 more systems." "That is what the humans said," Torvan replied carefully. General Vorik of the Keth, a heavy four-armed species covered in thick gray plates, slammed one of his fists on the table. "This is an insult. The humans sat in their corner for 40 years while we bled, and now they want us to run so they can play soldier? How many ships do they even have? 1,000? Less? The Vrathan have 12,000 in the forward corridor alone." 900, Torvan said quietly. The room erupted. Several officers laughed. Vorik made a sound that in his language was the equivalent of spitting. But not everyone was laughing. Ambassador Selith of the Gela, Torvan's own superior, watched the chaos with her large compound eyes and said nothing for a long time. When the noise finally died down, she spoke. "I have dealt with humans for 30 years through trade agreements," she said. "They are not a species that makes empty promises. They do not bluff, and they do not speak carelessly." "They are small and fragile," Vorik said dismissively. "Yes," Selith agreed. "And yet they are the only species in this room that has never lost a war." That silenced the chamber for a moment. Admiral Rathan looked at Torvan. What exactly did the human admiral say would happen after 9 hours? "He said anything in the combat zone that was not human would be treated as hostile," Torvan said. "And he said they would not ask twice." The room argued for another 2 hours. In the end, the decision was made to comply, not because they believed in the humans, but because they had no better option. The coalition fleet was broken. Another major engagement with the Vrethan would finish them. Pulling back behind the Mirren line at least gave them time. And if the humans wanted to throw their tiny fleet into the fire, that was their own foolish choice. Orders went out. Coalition ships began their retreat. While the aliens argued and retreated, something very different was happening across human space. Aboard the Blackwood, Lieutenant Megan Ortiz sat alone in a secure briefing room, reading through classified files that had just been unlocked by the conditioned Prometheus order. She had known that Earth's military was more capable than it appeared. Every officer above a certain rank knew that. But she had not known the full scope of it. No one had. The files told a story that stretched back 40 years, to the very beginning of the Pale Drift War. When the Coalition first invited humanity to join the Alliance and fight the Vrethin, the public answer had been no. But behind closed doors, a very different decision had been made. Earth's leadership had looked at the war, studied the Vrethin, studied the Coalition, and made a cold calculation. The Coalition was large, but disorganized. The Vrethin were powerful, but predictable. Neither side was going to win quickly. The war would drag on for decades, and when it finally ended, the galaxy would be reshaped. Earth decided to use that time. For 40 years, while the galaxy thought humans were hiding, They were doing something far more dangerous. They were watching, learning, and building. Megan scrolled through file after file, her eyes growing wider with each one. Human intelligence operatives had been embedded in every faction of the war since the beginning. Not just in the Coalition, but inside the Vrethan Dominion itself. They had mapped every Vrethan fleet formation, every supply line, every communication relay, every command structure. They knew the names of Vrethan commanders. They knew the rotation schedules of their patrols. They knew the exact frequency of their military communication network and every encryption key it used. At the same time, human engineers had been collecting alien technology through trade, salvage, and quiet theft. They did not simply copy it. They studied it, found its weaknesses, and built something better. The Coalition species relied on energy weapons, plasma cannons, and particle beams. The Vrethan used biological weaponry and overwhelming numbers. Both sides fought with brute force. Humans took a different path. They built ships that were faster, quieter, and smarter than anything else in the galaxy. Every human warship carried an adaptive electronic warfare suite, a system that could listen to enemy communications, decode them in real time, and either jam them completely or feed back false information. It could take control of enemy targeting systems, redirect their missiles, and blind their sensors. Their weapons were not flashy. They did not glow or hum or crackle with energy. Human weapons were simple in concept and terrifying in effect. Kinetic accelerators fired dense metal slugs at a fraction of the speed of light. At those velocities, a piece of metal the size of a fist hit with the force of a nuclear explosion. There were no shields in the galaxy that could stop raw physics, moving that fast. Beyond that, they had developed swarm drones, hundreds of thousands of small, fast, unmanned vehicles that operated together with perfect coordination. Each drone could identify targets, prioritize threats, and attack weak points on enemy ships with surgical precision. A single carrier could deploy 40,000 of them in under a minute. And then there was the armor. Human ships were coated in reactive nanoweave, a material that learned. Every time it was hit, it analyzed the energy signature of the weapon and adjusted its molecular structure to better resist the next hit. The more you shot at a human ship, the harder it became to damage. Megan closed the last file and sat back in her chair. Her hands were shaking slightly. She understood now why Hobbs had been so calm. Why Hale never seemed worried. They were not walking into a fight. They were walking into an execution. She found Hale standing at a viewport near the forward observation deck. The fleet was forming up around them, hundreds of ships moving into precise formations with the kind of coordination that came from years of drilling. Destroyers and frigates took their positions on the flanks. Electronic warfare cruisers settled into the center. Carriers opened their bays, running final checks on swarm drone deployment systems. And at the heart of the formation, 3 ships that Megan had only ever seen in classified diagrams moved into position for the first time. They were dreadnoughts, the largest warships Earth had ever built. Each one was over 2 kilometers long, armored in layers of nanoweave so thick that they looked almost black. Their names were painted on their hulls in simple white letters: the Anvil, the Gallows, and the Vigil. They had never been deployed, never been tested in real combat. They had been built for one purpose, and that purpose had just arrived. Megan stood beside Hale and looked out at the fleet. For a long time, neither of them spoke. "I read the briefing files," she said finally. "And?" Hale asked. "We have been planning this for 40 years. "Yes. Every drill, every exercise, every intelligence operation, all of it was building toward this." "Yes." Megan was quiet for a moment. Then she asked, "Do you think they know what is coming?" Hale watched the dreadnoughts settle into formation, their dark hulls catching the faint light of distant stars. "Nobody does," he said. The fleet was ready, 900 warships, each one carrying technology the galaxy had never seen, crewed by men and women who had trained their entire careers for a fight they hoped would never come. It had come. Admiral Hobbs transmitted one final message to the fleet before they departed. It was short and simple. You know what we built. You know why we built it. Today, we use it. Make it count. Make it fast. And when it is done, bring everyone home. At exactly the 9-hour mark, with the Coalition fleet safely behind the Mirren line, the entire United Earth fleet jumped to faster-than-light travel in perfect synchronization. 900 ships moved as one, vanishing from Earth's space in a ripple of light that lasted less than a second. The galaxy had been at war for 40 years. The Vrethan Dominion's forward invasion corridor was a massive stretch of space, covering 14 star systems. It was the heart of their military operation, the staging ground for the final push that would break the Coalition once and for all. Over 12,000 warships were positioned across the corridor, along with dozens of mobile command stations, fuel depots, troop transports, and harvester ships that processed the biological material stripped from conquered worlds. Supreme Commander Ashkareth stood aboard his flagship, the Devourer of Suns, and reviewed the latest intelligence reports. The Coalition had pulled back behind the Mirren line. Every ship, every soldier, every shuttle had retreated. Ashkareth was pleased. He was a towering figure even by Vrethan standards, over 3 meters tall, his body encased in living bioarmor that pulsed faintly with each heartbeat. His eyes were black and cold, and he had not known fear in his entire life. He interpreted the Coalition's retreat as the final collapse. 40 years of war had broken their spirit at last. He ordered a full advance. Every Vrethan fleet in the corridor was to push forward immediately and strike at the Coalition homeworlds before they could rebuild. His officers obeyed without question. 12,000 warships began to move. They never reached the Mirren line. The United Earth fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at exactly 1400 hours, coordinated Earth time. They did not arrive at the edge of the combat zone. They did not take up a defensive position. They did not announce themselves. They appeared directly in the center of the Vrethan formation. Every military doctrine in the known galaxy said this was suicide. Dropping a fleet into the middle of an enemy force 12 times its size meant being surrounded instantly, cut off from retreat, and destroyed. No commander in the history of the Coalition or the Dominion had ever attempted it. But the humans had not come to fight by the galaxy's rules. In the first 60 seconds, before the Vrethan could even process what was happening, Earth's electronic warfare cruisers activated their systems at full power. A wave of signal interference swept across the entire corridor like a silent storm. Every Vrethan communication channel was jammed. Every sensor feed was corrupted. Every targeting system began feeding false data to the ships that depended on it. 12,000 warships lost contact with each other in less than a minute. The Vrethan fleet, which had been a coordinated military force moments before, became a confused and scattered mob. Ships that had been moving in formation suddenly could not tell where their allies were. Commanders shouted orders into communication systems that only gave them static. Weapons officers watched their targeting displays fill with ghost signals, false contacts that appeared and vanished, drawing fire toward empty space. Captain Danny Hale sat in his command chair aboard the Blackwood, watching his tactical display with calm focus. Around him, his bridge crew worked with quiet efficiency, each person locked into their role. There was no shouting, no panic. The Blackwood was the nerve center of the entire operation, receiving data from every ship in the fleet and distributing orders in real time. Jamming is holding across all sectors, Megan Ortiz reported from their station. They are blind and deaf. Good, Hale said. Deploy the swarms. Across the fleet, carrier bays opened. What came out of them looked like clouds of black dust, vast and spreading. Hundreds of thousands of swarm drones poured into space, each one barely larger than a human fist, each one carrying a small but powerful explosive charge and a guidance system that could identify specific components on enemy ships. They moved together like living things, flowing around obstacles, splitting and reforming, targeting engines, weapons, and shield generators with precision that no living pilot could match. The first Brethren ships began to die within minutes. The drones hit them everywhere at once. Engine nozzles were shredded by dozens of simultaneous impacts. Weapon turrets were ripped from their mounts. Shield generators were destroyed before they could power up fully. The Brethren ships were built to withstand plasma fire and energy lances from other warships. They were not built to withstand 10,000 tiny explosions hitting every weak point on their hull at the same time. Destroyer groups moved through the chaos in pre-assigned patterns, each group targeting a specific section of the Brethren formation. They did not engage in traditional ship-to-ship combat. They did not trade fire at long range. They moved fast, fired their kinetic accelerators at close range, and moved on before the enemy could react. Every target had been assigned before the fleet even arrived. Every approach angle had been calculated. Every escape route had been mapped. By the end of the first hour, over 3,000 Brethren warships had been destroyed or disabled. As Kareth stood on the bridge of the Devourer of Suns and watched his empire come apart. His communication officers could not reach any other ship. His sensors showed a swirling mess of false contacts and real explosions that was impossible to separate. Reports that did manage to get through, carried by desperate crews using short-range visual signals, told the same story from every direction. Small, fast, dark ships that struck without warning. Clouds of tiny weapons that ate through hulls like acid. And behind it all, a wall of electronic noise that made coordination impossible. He gave the order to switch to manual systems. Abandon electronic targeting. Abandon long-range communication. Use visual identification. Use close-range signal lamps. Revert to the oldest and simplest methods of warfare. It was the right decision. It was also exactly what the humans expected him to do. The second hour began. With the Brethren switching to manual systems, their ships began to cluster together, grouping up so they could see each other and coordinate visually. This was a natural response. There was safety in numbers. But by grouping together, they made themselves into dense, concentrated targets. The three dreadnoughts moved forward. The Anvil, the Gallows, and the Vigil advanced into the thickest concentrations of Brethren ships, with the slow, heavy certainty of something that could not be stopped. Their kinetic batteries opened fire. Each round was a dense slug of metal, accelerated to a fraction of light speed. When a round hit a Brethren warship, the effect was not like an explosion. It was like a fist punching through paper. The slug passed through the hull, through the interior, and out the other side, and the sheer energy of its passage tore the ship apart from the inside. Secondary explosions followed, as power cores ruptured and fuel lines ignited. The Brethren had never faced kinetic weapons at this scale. Their armor was designed for energy resistance, built to absorb and distribute heat. But kinetic impacts were raw force, mass and speed, and no amount of heat-resistant plating could stop a metal slug moving at 60,000 kilometers per second. Ships burst apart in clusters, 3 at a time, 5 at a time. The dreadnoughts fired in steady, measured volleys, each shot carefully aimed, each shot a kill. Megan Ortiz watched the numbers on her display. 12,000 had become 9,000 in the first hour. Now 9,000 became 6, then 4. The rate of destruction was staggering. She had studied warfare her entire career, and she had never seen anything like this. No one had. Kareth made his final move. He managed to rally a core group of 800 warships around his flagship, using visual signals and brute force coordination. It was an impressive feat under the circumstances. He organized them into a tight assault formation and aimed them directly at the Blackwood. He had identified it as the command ship by watching the patterns of human fleet movement. Kill the brain, and the body would die. Danny Hale saw the counterattack forming on his display. 800 ships coming straight at him in a concentrated spear formation. It was the largest organized Vrethan force left in the corridor. "They are making a run at us," Megan said, tension creeping into her voice for the first time. Hale studied the display for 3 seconds. Then he said, "Bring us forward, directly toward them." Megan looked at him. "Toward them?" "Toward them," Hale confirmed. "Signal the swarm carriers to concentrate drone coverage along our approach corridor. I want the densest kill box we can build between us and that formation." The Blackwood moved forward. The Vrethan charged. 800 warships against 1 carrier and a cloud of drones. The two forces met in a corridor of space, barely 200 kilometers wide. The Vrethan came in fast and hard, firing everything they had. Plasma bolts and biological acid rounds slammed into the Blackwood's nano-weave armor, and the armor did what it was built to do. It absorbed the hits, analyzed the energy patterns, and hardened. Each volley did less damage than the one before. And then, the drones closed in from every direction. The kill box was a nightmare. Vrethan ships flew into a space that was saturated with tens of thousands of drones, all of them locking onto targets simultaneously. Ships that tried to push through had their engines destroyed and drifted helplessly. Ships that tried to turn back collided with the ships behind them. The formation broke apart in minutes, and what had been an organized counterattack became a chaotic mess of burning wreckage. That was how long it lasted. The third hour began with silence. The surviving Vrethan forces were scattered across the corridor in small, disorganized groups. They had no communication, no coordination, no leadership. Many of them had stopped fighting entirely, drifting with powered-down weapons, waiting for something they could not name. Azkarat's flagship, the Devourer of Suns, was found by the dreadnought Vigil. A single precision strike destroyed its engines. The massive ship drifted, venting atmosphere, its weapons dark. Danny Hale opened a communication channel. It was the first direct human broadcast to the Vrethan in the entire war. His voice was carried across every frequency, cutting through the jamming with a clarity that was almost cruel. "This war is over," he said. "Power down your weapons and await boarding. You will not be harmed. You will not be asked again." For a long moment, nothing happened. The stars watched. Then, one by one, the surviving Vrethan ships powered down. Their weapons went silent. Their engines went cold. Their running lights dimmed to nothing. In the vast darkness of the corridor, the only ships still moving were human. The Pale Drift War, which had raged across the galaxy for 40 years and claimed billions of lives, ended in 180 minutes. 3 hours. Aboard the Blackwood, the bridge was quiet. No one cheered. No one celebrated. The crew sat at their stations and stared at displays that showed a battlefield littered with the wreckage of 12,000 warships. Megan Ortiz looked at Hale. He was still sitting in his command chair, his hands resting on the armrests, his face showing nothing. "It is done," she said softly. Hale nodded once. He reached for his coffee, found it had gone cold, and set it back down. "Get me a damage report, and start search and rescue operations. Every escape pod, every survivor, ours and theirs." The crew began to move again, slowly, quietly, like people waking up from a dream they were not sure was real. Outside, the stars were the same as they had always been, but everything else had changed. The news spread across the galaxy like a shockwave. At first, no one believed it. The reports that came through were so impossible, so far beyond anything anyone had expected, that most coalition leaders assumed they were errors, faulty data, mistranslations, some kind of trick. The Pale Drift War, which had consumed 7 civilizations for 40 years, had ended. Not in a final desperate battle, not in a slow, grinding surrender. It had ended in 3 hours, and it had been ended by the species that everyone had dismissed as too small, too soft, and too afraid to fight. Torvald was among the first to see the aftermath with his own eyes. He traveled to the battle site aboard a coalition observation vessel, a small diplomatic ship that had been granted permission to enter the former combat zone. The journey took 2 days, and during those 2 days, he barely slept. He spent most of his time reviewing the data that was coming in from human fleet transmissions, trying to make sense of numbers that did not seem real. When his ship finally arrived at the edge of the wreckage field, Torvald stood at the observation window and felt something he had never felt before in his long career as a diplomat. He felt small. The wreckage stretched across light minutes of space. Thousands of Vrethan hulks drifted in the void, broken and dark. Some were split cleanly in half, the edges of their wounds still glowing faintly with residual heat. Others were riddled with thousands of tiny holes, as if eaten by insects, their interiors gutted and hollow. Command stations the size of small cities floated in pieces. Fuel depots had become expanding clouds of frozen gas. The entire corridor looked like a graveyard built by something that did not care how big you were or how strong you thought you were. And among the wreckage, moving quietly and steadily, was the human fleet. Torvald watched them through the observation window. The human ships moved in small groups, deploying shuttles and recovery teams. They were scanning wreckage, locating escape pods, and picking up survivors. Search and rescue operations were running across the entire corridor, covering a volume of space so vast that it would take weeks to finish. What Torvald saw next was the thing that disturbed him most. More than the wreckage, more than the scale of the destruction, more than the cold efficiency with which the humans had dismantled the most powerful military force in the galaxy. The humans were helping the enemy. Vrethan escape pods were being recovered alongside human ones. Vrethan wounded were being brought aboard human medical ships and treated by human doctors. Prisoners were being catalogued, identified, and held in conditions that were, by any standard, humane. Torvald watched through a long-range visual feed as a human medical shuttle docked with a crippled Vrethan transport that was drifting without power. A boarding team entered the transport and began evacuating survivors. Among the team was a young medic named Katie Marsh. Katie was 26 years old, with short brown hair and steady hands. She had trained as a combat medic for 4 years and had never actually seen combat until 3 hours ago. Now she was walking through the dark corridors of a Vrethan transport ship, her medical kit over her shoulder, looking for survivors. She found them in what appeared to be a crew quarters. 7 Vrethan warriors, each one nearly 3 meters tall, covered in dark bioarmor, huddled in a corner of the room. 3 of them were wounded. 1 had lost an arm. Another was bleeding from a deep gash in its side. The 3rd was barely conscious, its breathing shallow and labored. The 4 unwounded Vrethans saw Katie enter and immediately moved to block her path. They were terrified. Their eyes, those deep black Vrethan eyes, were wide and fixed on her. They did not know what to expect from the species that had just destroyed their entire fleet in less time than it took to eat a meal. Katie stopped. She held up her hands, showing them empty. Then she slowly pointed to her medical kit, and then to the wounded soldiers on the floor. The Vrethan did not move. Katie knelt down, opened her kit, and pulled out a bandage. She held it up so they could see it. Then she pointed again to the wounded. One of the Vrethan, the largest one, looked at the bandage, looked at Katie, and then slowly stepped aside. Katie moved to the most badly wounded soldier first, the one who was barely breathing. She worked quickly and carefully, using her scanner to identify the alien biology, adjusting her techniques on the fly. Vrethin physiology was different from human, but the basics were the same. Stop the bleeding, stabilize the patient, keep them breathing. She spoke to the wounded soldier softly as she worked, even though he could not understand her words. She told him he was going to be okay. She told him to stay still. Her voice was calm and gentle, and the soldier, a creature bred for war and conquest, lay still beneath her hands and let her save his life. Torvald watched this scene on his display and felt a chill run through his body that had nothing to do with the cold of space. 2 days later, an emergency summit was convened on Aethys Prime. Every surviving leader of the coalition attended. The war chamber that had been filled with desperation and fear just a week earlier was now filled with something different. It was still fear, but it was a new kind of fear. Not fear of the Vrethin, fear of the humans. The conversations in the corridors outside the chamber were quiet and nervous. Diplomats and officers from 7 different species gathered in small groups and spoke in low voices. They destroyed 12,000 ships in 3 hours. They had only 900. Their technology is beyond anything we have seen. They were watching us the entire time. 40 years. They knew everything. If they had joined the Vrethin instead of helping us, do not finish that thought. The formal session began with a presentation of the battle data. Coalition military analysts have been studying the human fleet's tactics since the engagement ended, and their findings were presented to the assembled leaders in painful detail. The humans had not won through bravery or luck. They had won through total, absolute dominance of every aspect of warfare. Information, technology, coordination, speed, firepower, medical support, logistics. There was not a single category in which the Vrethin had held any advantage. Not one. General Vorik, the same Keth officer who had laughed at the idea of human intervention just days earlier, sat in his seat and said nothing throughout the entire presentation. His 4 hands were folded in his lap. His face, usually animated with aggression and confidence, was blank. When the presentation ended, Admiral Rethan of the Tyranny asked the question that was on everyone's mind, but that no one wanted to say out loud. If the humans could do this to the Vrethin, what could they do to us? The room was silent. Then a holographic image flickered to life at the center of the chamber. Admiral Karl Hobbs appeared, transmitted from Earth's orbital station. He looked the same as he always did, calm, steady, unremarkable. I will save you the trouble of worrying, Hobbs said. We did not enter this war for conquest. We did not enter it for territory, for resources, or for political advantage. We entered it because Ambassador Torvan came to us and asked for help, and because the Vrethin were committing acts that we could not ignore any longer. He paused and let that settle. We want nothing from you. We want nothing from the Vrethin, except their word that this is finished. Earth will return to its borders. Our fleet will stand down. Your alliance will continue as it was, and we will not interfere in your affairs. Hobbs looked around the room, his gaze steady and direct, even through the holographic projection. But understand this clearly, he said. We will be watching. We have always been watching. And if this happens again, from any direction, from any species, our response will not take 3 hours. The transmission ended. The room remained silent for a long time. Far from Aethys Prime, aboard the Blackwood, Danny Hale received word that the war had been officially declared over. The Coalition and the remnants of the Vrethin Dominion had agreed to a ceasefire, mediated by Earth. Prisoners would be exchanged. Borders would be redrawn. Reconstruction would begin. Hale sat in his command chair on the bridge and read the message twice. Then he set the datapad down and stared out at the stars through the viewport. The wreckage field was still visible. a faint dark smear against the backdrop of space, slowly spreading and fading. The bridge was quiet. Most of the crew had been running on little sleep for days, managing search and rescue operations around the clock. They were tired. Not the kind of tired that came from physical work, but the deeper kind that came from seeing too much and feeling too much and not having time to process any of it. Megan Ortiz came up from the tactical center with 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Hale and sat in the chair next to him. For a while, neither of them spoke. "The official count is in," Megan said eventually. "Vrethan losses, 11,412, ships destroyed or captured. Coalition losses during the retreat, 0. Human losses," she paused. 37 ships damaged, 4 destroyed. 81 crew members killed. Hale closed his eyes for a moment. 81 people. That was the cost. 81 men and women who had woken up that morning and put on their uniforms and gone to their stations and done their jobs, and who were not coming home. 81, he said quietly. Yes. Hale opened his eyes and looked at the stars. "You all right?" Megan asked. He took a slow breath and let it out. "Ask me tomorrow," he said. Megan nodded. She did not push. She understood. Some things needed time before they could be spoken about, and some things could never be spoken about at all. Around them, the crew of the Blackwood continued their work. There were still survivors to find, still wreckage to clear, still a galaxy to put back together. The war was over, but the work was just beginning. And somewhere in the quiet corridors of the ship, Katie Marsh was sitting in the medical bay, writing a report on the 7 Vrethan soldiers she had treated. She listed their injuries, their treatments, and their current conditions. Under the section marked Patient Disposition, she wrote the same thing for each one: stable, recovering, cooperative. She did not write about the way the largest Vrethan had stepped aside to let her help. She did not write about the way the wounded soldier had looked at her when she finished treating him, his black eyes holding something she could not name but understood perfectly. Some things did not fit in reports. 6 months passed, and the galaxy was a different place. The Vrethan Dominion, which had terrorized hundreds of star systems for decades, no longer existed as a political entity. Without their military, the entire structure had collapsed like a building with its foundations pulled out. The client species and subjugated worlds that the Vrethan had held under their control for generations broke free, one after another. New governments formed. New borders were drawn. Old grudges surfaced and were negotiated, sometimes peacefully, sometimes not. But the wars that followed were small and local, and they burned themselves out quickly. Nobody wanted to attract the attention of the species that had ended the last war in 3 hours. The coalition restructured itself. Officially, humanity was listed as a nominal member of the alliance. Unofficially, everyone understood the truth. Earth was not a member. Earth was the reason the alliance still existed. The power balance of the galaxy had shifted so completely and so suddenly that diplomats and historians were still trying to find the right words for what had happened. Trade between human colonies and alien civilizations exploded. Goods, technology, culture, and knowledge flowed back and forth across borders that had been closed for decades. Alien scholars flooded into Earth's universities, studying everything from human engineering to human history to human art. They were trying to understand something that confused them deeply: how such a young, fragile, and short-lived species had built something so powerful without anyone noticing. The answers they found were not comforting. Humans did not have a single advantage that made them dangerous. They had dozens of small advantages that, added together, created something greater than the sum of its parts. They were adaptable. They learned fast. They cooperated across vast distances with a level of coordination that most species could not match. They were creative in ways that were unpredictable, finding solutions to problems that other species did not even recognize as problems. And perhaps most unsettling of all, they were patient. They could plan on a scale of decades and execute those plans with discipline and focus that never wavered. The Gela scholar Silith, who had argued in favor of trusting the humans before the battle, published a paper that became widely read across the coalition. In it, she wrote a passage that was quoted in diplomatic circles for years afterward. "We looked at humans and saw a species without claws. We should have looked more carefully. They did not need claws, they had patience, and patience is the most dangerous weapon in the universe." On Earth, life continued with a strange kind of normalcy. The fleet stood down, as Hobbes had promised. Ships returned to their home ports. Crews went on leave. The massive military infrastructure that had been built over 4 decades settled into a quiet maintenance mode. It was still there. Everyone knew it was still there, but it was not being used, and that was the point. HFY, the former Supreme Commander of the Vrethan Dominion, was alive. He had been recovered from his crippled flagship by a human boarding team and taken into custody without incident. For 6 months, he was held in a neutral detention facility on a space station, far from both Vrethan and Coalition space. The facility was clean, well-maintained, and humane. He was fed regularly, given medical attention, and allowed exercise. He was not mistreated. He refused to speak to anyone. Coalition interrogators came and went. Diplomats tried to negotiate. Military analysts tried to debrief him. He sat in his cell and said nothing, his black eyes staring at the wall, his bio-armor dimmed and inactive. The only person he agreed to see was Danny Hale. Hale came alone. He walked into the small visiting room in his uniform, sat down across from the former Supreme Commander, and waited. HFY studied him for a long time. Hale was not impressive to look at by Vrethan standards. He was small, barely half the height of a Vrethan warrior. He had no armor, no natural weapons, no visible strength. He looked like something the Vrethan would have harvested without a second thought. And yet this was the man who had commanded the fleet that destroyed the Dominion's entire military in a single afternoon. "I have one question," HFY said. His voice was deep and rough, translated through a small device on the table between them. "Go ahead." "Why did you wait?" It was a simple question, but it carried the weight of 40 years of war and billions of lives lost. Hale was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hands, then back at the Vrethan. "Because we hoped someone else would stop you first," he said. HFY absorbed this. His expression did not change, but something shifted in his eyes. Understanding, perhaps, or something close to it. "And if no one had asked for your help," he said, "if the ambassador had not come?" Hale met his gaze. "He came." HFY nodded slowly. "You are a strange species." "So we have been told," Hale said. That was the end of the conversation. Hale stood, buttoned his coat, and left. He did not look back. Megan Ortiz was promoted 3 weeks after the war ended. She was reassigned to Earth's Strategic Intelligence Division, where she would oversee the integration of alien intelligence networks into humanity's existing framework. It was a massive job, the kind that would define the rest of her career. She accepted it without hesitation. Before she left the Blackwood, she stopped by Hale's quarters. He was packing a small bag for shore leave, the first he had taken in over 2 years. "I wanted to say goodbye before I shipped out," she said. Hale looked up. "It is not goodbye. It is just a different assignment." Megan smiled slightly. "You know what I mean." They stood in the small quarters, surrounded by the quiet hum of the ship, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. They had served together for 5 years. They had trained together, planned together, and fought together. They had watched a galaxy change in 3 hours, and spent 6 months trying to understand what that meant. "I do not know if what we did was right," Megan said finally. We built all of that in secret. We watched them die for 40 years while we prepared. We could have helped sooner. We could have saved millions of lives. Hale set down the bag and looked at her directly. Maybe, he said. But if we had gone in sooner, before we were ready, we might have lost. And if we had lost, or even if we had won slowly, the galaxy would have seen humans as just another species fighting another war. Instead, they saw something they will never forget. 3 hours. That is not a battle. That is a message. A message, Megan repeated. That there are some lines you do not cross, Hale said. And if you cross them, the response will be so fast and so complete that no one will ever think about crossing them again. Then she nodded. Take care of yourself, Danny, she said. You too, Megan. She left the Blackwood that afternoon. She did not look back either. Katie Marsh returned to Earth on a transport ship filled with other crew members heading home. She was quiet during the journey. She spent most of her time reading or looking out the windows at the stars. When she arrived, she was offered a commendation for her conduct during the search and rescue operations. She was told there would be a ceremony. Important people would be there. It would look good on her record. She did not attend. Instead, she went back to work at a hospital on the lunar colony, treating patients the same way she had always done. Broken bones, infections, routine surgeries, ordinary things. A journalist tracked her down a few weeks later, looking for a story about the human medic who had treated enemy soldiers on the battlefield. The journalist asked her what it was like to help the Vrethen, what it felt like to save the lives of creatures that had killed billions. Katie thought about it for a moment. She thought about the wounded soldier on the transport ship, his black eyes looking up at her while she worked. She thought about the way his breathing had steadied under her hands. They were hurt, she said. That is all I needed to know. The journalist waited for more. Katie did not give more. She excused herself and went back to her patients. Admiral Carl Hobbs retired on a Tuesday morning, without ceremony. He signed the paperwork, handed over his codes, and walked out of the Naval Command headquarters for the last time. He moved to a small house on the Oregon coast, a place he had bought years ago but never had time to visit. It had a porch that looked out over the ocean, and a small dock where he kept a fishing boat. He spent his days fishing, reading, and watching the waves. He did not give interviews. He did not write memoirs. He did not attend reunions or accept speaking engagements. When old colleagues visited, he was warm and welcoming, but he never talked about the war. One afternoon, an old friend from his early Navy days sat on the porch with him, drinking beer and watching the sunset. The friend had been at the battle, commanding a destroyer. He asked Hobbs the question that many people had asked, in many different ways, over the past 6 months. You spent your entire career building that fleet. 40 years, your whole life, and you hoped you would never have to use it. Why? Hobbs was quiet for a while. He watched the waves roll in, slow and steady, the way they always did. That is the whole point, he said finally. You build the fire so big that no one dares to light it. And when someone finally does, you make sure it only burns once. His friend thought about that, and nodded slowly. They sat together in comfortable silence until the sun went down. The Blackwood was reassigned to peacetime patrol duty along the outer rim, the quiet edge of human space where the stars thinned out and the dark between galaxies began. It was a long, uneventful assignment. Most crews would have found it boring. Danny Hale found it exactly what he needed. He stood at the forward viewport one evening, looking out at the quiet dark. His ship hummed softly around him, the sound of systems running smoothly, of a crew doing their jobs with the easy confidence of people who knew they were good at what they did. Somewhere out in that darkness, a galaxy was learning to live with a new reality. The species that had ended a 40-year war in 3 hours was out there, watching, waiting, and hoping it would never have to do it again. They did not roar. They did not boast. They did not build monuments or demand tribute. They simply went back to their lives, their borders, their quiet corners of space, and carried the weight of what they had done without complaint. Hale picked up his coffee from the armrest of his chair. It was warm this time. He took a slow sip and set it down again. 3 hours, he said to no one in particular. Let us hope that is enough to make them remember. The stars did not answer. They never did. But the silence, for the first time in 40 years, felt like peace. The war had been going on for 40 years. 40 long, bloody, terrible years. 7 alien civilizations, bound together by old treaties and promises, had been fighting the Vrethan Dominion across hundreds of star systems. They called it the Pale Drift War, and it had taken more lives than anyone could count anymore. The Vrethan were not like other species. They did not conquer worlds to rule them. They consumed them. They stripped planets bare of every resource, harvested populations for biological fuel, and left behind nothing but ash and silence. They were tall, armored creatures with dark eyes and no mercy. Their fleets numbered in the tens of thousands, and for 40 years they had been winning. The 7 species that stood against them called themselves the Allied Stellar Coalition. They had brave soldiers. They had good ships. They had numbers. But the Vrethan were relentless, and slowly, year after year, the coalition was losing ground. And through all of it, through every battle and every burning world, humanity said nothing. Earth and its colonies sat behind their borders, quiet and still. They had been invited to join the coalition decades ago, but they had politely refused. They said they had a policy of non-intervention. They said the war was not their concern. Most of the alien species accepted this without surprise. Humans were, after all, a young species. They had only been traveling between stars for a little over 200 years. They were small, soft, and short-lived. They had no claws, no natural armor, no telepathy, no venom, no size advantage. Compared to the towering Vrethan, or the armored Gela, or the psychic Tyranni, humans seemed almost pitiful. Most coalition leaders did not even think about humans anymore. They were irrelevant. A minor civilization hiding in a quiet corner of the galaxy, too weak and too afraid to fight. They were wrong. But they would not learn that for a while yet. Captain Danny Hale stood on the bridge of the carrier vessel Blackwood and watched the stars through the wide forward viewport. He was a man in his late 40s with short gray hair and a thin scar that ran from his left ear to his jaw. He had earned that scar 15 years ago during a border skirmish with pirates near a mining colony. He had not talked about it since. Hale was known among his crew for 2 things. First, he never raised his voice, not in a crisis, not in a fight. Not even when a junior officer once accidentally vented atmosphere from a cargo bay. He simply gave orders in the same steady, quiet tone he used for everything else. Second, he never made a decision he had not thought about carefully. He was not slow, and the people who served under him trusted him completely because of it. Standing beside him on the bridge was Lieutenant Megan Ortiz, his tactical analyst, and the person he relied on more than anyone else aboard the ship. Megan was in her early 30s, sharp-featured, with dark hair pulled back tight. She had a quick mind and a quicker tongue, and she was not afraid to tell Hale when she thought he was wrong. He valued that more than she knew. Megan carried a weight she did not talk about often. Her father had been a cargo hauler on a mining colony near the Outer Rim. When she was 14, a pirate raid hit the colony. Her father died trying to get other families to the emergency shelters. She had never forgotten the feeling of waiting in the dark, not knowing if he was coming back. He never did. She had joined the United Earth Naval Command 2 years later, the youngest recruit in her class. She told herself it was because she wanted to protect people. That was true. but part of her also wanted to make sure she was never helpless again. Today, both of them were watching the same newsfeed on the bridge display. The Battle of Selhari Rift had ended 6 hours ago. The Coalition had lost, badly. Over 300 warships had been destroyed in a single engagement. The Vrethan had sprung a trap, drawing the Coalition fleet into a narrow corridor between two gas giants, and then closing in from both sides. The footage was hard to watch. Ships breaking apart in silence, escape pods drifting through fields of debris, distress signals that went unanswered because there was no one left to answer them. The Vrethan were now pushing deeper into Coalition space, heading straight for the civilian worlds. Millions of people on those worlds had no military protection left. They were exposed, and everyone knew what the Vrethan did to exposed populations. "That is the third major defeat in 4 months," she said quietly. Hale nodded, but said nothing. 3 days later, a Coalition ambassador arrived at Earth's orbital station. His name was Torvan, and he was a member of the Gela species, tall insectoid beings with shimmering green shells and 4 delicate arms. Torvan had spent most of his career as a trade negotiator. He had never begged for anything in his life, but today he was here to beg. He was escorted to a small, dim briefing room deep inside the station. It was plain and cold, with gray walls and a single table. Admiral Karl Hobbs was already there, waiting. Hobbs was old, 73 years old, with a lined face and white hair cropped close to his skull. He had spent his entire career in the United Earth Naval Command, rising through the ranks, slowly and steadily. He did not give speeches. He did not seek attention. For decades, most people, including most of the humans who served under him, thought of him as a quiet bureaucrat managing a peacetime fleet. They were wrong about that too. Torvan sat across from Hobbs and laid out everything. He showed footage of the destroyed fleets. He showed images of the worlds the Vrethan had consumed. He presented numbers, casualties, projections, and timelines. He explained that without help, the Coalition would fall within a year, maybe less. Hobbs listened. He did not interrupt. He did not ask questions. He simply watched and listened, his hands folded on the table in front of him, his expression unreadable. When Torvan finished, there was a long silence. Then Hobbs stood. He buttoned his uniform coat slowly, straightened the collar, and looked directly at the ambassador. "Tell your leaders to pull their forces back behind the Mirren line," he said. "All of them. Every ship, every soldier, every shuttle. You have 9 hours." Torvan stared at him. "I do not understand. Why would we retreat further?" "Because after 9 hours," Hobbs said, "anything still in the combat zone that is not human will be treated as hostile." Torvan opened his mouth to respond, but stopped. Something in Hobbs' voice had changed. It was still quiet, still calm, but underneath the calm there was something heavy and absolute, like the sound of a door closing for the last time. "We do not ask twice," Hobbs said. Torvan left the station 20 minutes later, carrying a message he did not fully understand to leaders who would not fully believe it. Then he walked to the station's secure communication center, sat down at a terminal, and entered a code he had memorized 30 years ago. A single phrase transmitted across every United Earth military channel, reaching every ship, every base, every outpost, every soldier in the fleet. "Condition Prometheus. Engage." Aboard the Blackwood, Danny Hale heard the words come through the bridge speakers. The entire crew went still. Megan Ortiz looked at him, her eyes wide. Hale took a slow breath, set down his coffee, and stood. "You heard the order," he said calmly. "All stations, prepare for combat deployment. We move in 6 hours." No one cheered. No one shouted. The crew of the Blackwood simply turned to their stations and began to work. They had trained for this moment for years. Every drill, every simulation, every long, quiet patrol had been leading to this. Somewhere in the galaxy, a war that had burned for 40 years was about to meet something it had never faced before, and it had no idea what was coming.